He had been a trapper in the Yukon, a freight hauler on the Peace River Road, and a hired hand on 3 different ranches between Fort Macleod and the Saskatchewan border. For 11 years, Hector Dunmore had been a man who belonged nowhere in particular. And he had made his peace with that, or so he told himself every morning when he rolled out of a bedroll that smelled like pine smoke and cold leather. He was 51 years old when he finally turned his horse south toward home. The land he had inherited from his father was a quarter section near Pincher Creek, Alberta, dry grass country where the Chinook winds came through in January and fooled the cattle into thinking spring had arrived. His father had worked that land for 30 years. His father had died on it, alone in the November of 1923, and by the time word reached Hector up near Grande Prairie, the ground had already been frozen too hard to bury him properly until spring. Hector had not gone back then. He told himself it was because the roads were impassable. He told himself a lot of things over the years. Now it was April of 1934, and the Dust Bowl was eating the prairies alive. He had heard about it from men in Lethbridge, from a woman at a diner counter in Claresholm who had wept quietly into her coffee while her children sat beside her in clothes that were too thin for the season. The topsoil was lifting off the fields in black walls that people called rollers, and families were leaving in wagons with everything they owned piled on top, heading west toward British Columbia, heading anywhere that wasn't here. Hector's land had been sitting empty for 11 years. He found out 3 days before he arrived that it hadn't been sitting empty at all. A man at a feed store in Cowley told him, not meanly, just as a matter of local fact, that somebody had been living on the Dunmore place for going on 2 winters now. A woman, he said, young, and an older woman with her, maybe her mother or an aunt. Nobody was quite sure. Hector sat with that information for the better part of 40 miles. By the time he turned up the lane to his father's property, the sun was low and cutting hard across the land from the west, and the shadows of the fence posts stretched out long and thin ahead of him like fingers pointing the way. The cabin was still standing. Someone had patched the roof with fresh lumber, pale against the old gray boards. There was a kitchen garden staked out along the south wall, dormant still in the April cold, but properly laid, the rows straight and deliberate. Someone had been working this land. Someone had been working it with care. He rode into the yard and stopped. A woman came around the corner of the barn with a bucket in each hand and stopped when she saw him. She was 26 years old. He would learn that later, with dark hair pulled back and a canvas apron over a wool dress that had been mended at the elbows. She set both buckets down in the same motion, and before Hector had finished thinking she moved fast, she had already gone back around the corner of the barn and come back with a rifle leveled at his chest. "Get off the horse," she said, "and keep your hands where I can see them." Her name was Sylvie Beaumont. She was 26 years old, and she had not been frightened of much since she was 19, when her father's farm in southern Saskatchewan had blown away in a single afternoon. Not metaphorically, not exaggerated in the retelling, but literally blown away, the topsoil lifting off in a wall of black that turned noon into midnight and left nothing behind but hardpan and debt. Hector got off the horse slowly. He kept his hands visible. He had been on the wrong end of a firearm before, and he knew that moving carefully was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of sense. "This is Dunmore land," he said. "I'm Hector Dunmore." Something moved in Sylvie's expression, not softening, not yet, but a recalculation. She was 26, and she had spent 2 years working this land, and she was not going to flinch now. "There's nobody named Dunmore been here in 11 years, she said. "I have that on good authority." "You have it correct," Hector said. "I've been away." From the cabin door, an older woman appeared. She was 68 years old, slow on her feet but sharp-eyed, and she stood in the doorway watching with her arms folded across her chest. This was Eugenia Pratt. Sylvie's great-aunt, by a complicated route that Hector would eventually understand, involved a second marriage and a half-brother, and the kind of family arithmetic that was common enough on the frontier. Eugenia was 68 years old and had buried two husbands, lost a farm of her own to the bank in 1931, and was not easily impressed by the arrival of a large man on a tired horse. "What does he want?" Eugenia called out. "Says it's his land," Sylvie called back, without taking her eyes off Hector. Well, Eugenia unfolded her arms. "Is it?" Hector looked at the cabin. He looked at the garden. He looked at the barn, which someone had retimbered along the north wall, where the old planks had been rotting when his father was still alive. He looked at Sylvie Beaumont, 26 years old, holding that rifle as steady as a surveyor's level. "I have a deed," he said, "in my saddlebag. You're welcome to read it." "I'm welcome," Sylvie said, "to read it with the rifle pointed at you while you get it out." He got it out slowly. She read it. Eugenia came down from the cabin doorway and read it over Sylvie's shoulder, squinting in the fading light. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Sylvie lowered the rifle to a position that was not quite pointing at him, but was not quite not pointing at him either. "We've been here since October of '32, she said. "We fixed the roof. We dug out the well. We planted and kept a garden. We split 3 cords of wood last fall." She paused. "We haven't had anywhere else to go." Hector looked at the repaired roof. He looked at the straight garden rows. He thought about 11 years of not coming back. "Where'd you come from?" he asked. "Moose Jaw," Sylvie said. "Originally. Before that, a farm outside of Weyburn that doesn't exist anymore." She said it the way people said those things in 1934, flat, factual, with all the grief pressed down underneath. "Aunt Jeannie lost her place outside of Nanton when the bank called her loan in '31. We met up in Lethbridge and came north together." Eugenia made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been commentary on the whole situation. She was 68 years old and had heard enough hard-luck stories to know that hers was not unique, which was either comforting or the most depressing thing imaginable, depending on what kind of day she was having. Hector said, "Have you eaten?" Sylvie looked at him. It was not the question she had been expecting. "We have," she said carefully. "There's coffee," Eugenia said from behind her. "If you're not going to shoot him, Sylvie, he might as well come in." He slept in the barn that first night, which he had offered before either of them could suggest it. It seemed right. The cabin was theirs in a way that mattered even if the deed said otherwise, and Hector Dunmore, at 51 years old, had at least learned that legal ownership and moral claim were not always the same conversation. He lay in the straw listening to the wind come down off the Livingstone Range and thought about his father, who had built that cabin with lumber, hauled from Pinch Creek on a wagon with a broken spring. He thought about 11 years of not coming back. He did not sleep much. In the morning, Sylvie was already at the barn before sunrise, feeding the 2 horses, her mare and a bony gelding she introduced as belonging to Eugenia, though the gelding appeared to have opinions about this description. "You can stay," she said, without preamble, forking hay with her back to him. "If you want to. There's work enough for 3 people, and we've been short-handed." Hector sat on a fence rail and watched her work. "It's my land," he said, mildly. "I know it's your land," Sylvie said. "I'm not arguing that. I'm saying you can stay." She turned around and looked at him directly. "But if you're planning on selling it or leaving again in a month, tell me now so I can start figuring something else out." He was 51 years old. She was 26. She looked at him like someone who had been let down by enough people that she had made a policy of getting the relevant information in advance. "I'm not selling it," he said, "and I'm not leaving." She studied him for a moment the way you study ground before you put weight on it. "All right," she said, and went back to forking hay. "Now, I want to stop here for just a moment. If you're listening to this story, and I hope you are, right the way through, I'd love to know where in the world you're hearing it from. Are you in British Columbia, maybe watching snow come off the mountains, Saskatchewan, where the wind never quite stops? Maybe you're from Ontario or the Maritimes or somewhere much farther away than Canada altogether. Leave it in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story is speaking to you, a like goes a long way toward making sure more people find their way to frontier roots. Now, back to Hector and Sylvie. The arrangement that emerged over the following weeks was not spoken so much as it was built. The way things get built on working land, one task at a time, one day at a time, and you look back after a month and realize something solid is standing where there was nothing before. Hector was 51, and he knew horses, and he knew fences, and he knew how to read the sky in the particular way that men who have spent years outdoors learn to read it. Which is to say, he knew when rain was coming and when it wasn't, and the difference mattered on the southern Alberta prairie in ways that were not abstract. He fixed the section of fence along the north pasture that had been listing since, by the look of it, roughly 1928. He dug out the root cellar, which had taken on water over 2 winters. He built a proper woodshed against the east side of the barn, so the split wood wouldn't have to sit under canvas through the wet seasons. Sylvie watched him work. She was 26, and she was not a person who gave trust easily. She had good reasons for that. But she was fair, and what she saw was a man who knew how to do things and did them without drama and did not require praise for it. After about 3 weeks, she stopped watching quite so carefully. She managed the garden and the food preserves and the chickens, of which there were 7, and she kept the accounts, a small ledger in her own hand, every dollar of expenditure noted in pencil, every dollar of income from the eggs she sold twice a week to a woman in town. She was 26 years old, and she had been keeping accounts since she was 16, when her father's hands had started shaking too badly to write the numbers himself. She was precise about money in the way that people are precise about money when they have seen what happens when precision is abandoned. Eugenia, who was 68, did not work the way she once had. Her knees had been bad since a fall on ice in the winter of 1929, but she cooked, and she cooked well, and she had opinions about everything which she delivered in a dry, unhurried voice that managed to be simultaneously comforting and devastating, depending on whether you were the subject of the opinion or merely the audience for it. She had opinions about Hector. "He's not what I expected," she told Sylvie one evening, quietly, while Hector was outside. "What did you expect?" Sylvie said. "Someone who'd come in and start telling us how things were going to be," Eugenia said. "Men with deeds usually do. He hasn't." "No," Eugenia said, "he hasn't." She was quiet for a moment, adding salt to a pot. "He's 51 years old, and he's been alone a long time. You can see it in the way he sits at a table, like he's not quite sure someone else is going to be there tomorrow." Sylvie did not say anything. "I'm not meddling," Eugenia said. "You're always meddling," Sylvie said without heat. "I'm observing," Eugenia said with dignity. "There's a difference. One of them requires less effort." The thing about the land in that year, 1934, the worst of the Dust Bowl years on the southern prairies, was that it asked everything of you and offered no guarantees in return. Families in the townships around them were leaving. The Hendersons from 3 miles east had gone in March. The Pollock family, who had been on their section since before the war, loaded up in May and headed for the Fraser Valley in British Columbia. Hector passed the Pollock place on a trip to town in June, and the house was already beginning to take on that look that abandoned buildings take. A subtle deflation, as though the structure itself had exhaled and not breathed back in. He did not tell Sylvie what the Pollock place looked like. She had enough to think about. The Dunmore quarter section held, partly because the land along the creek bottom held moisture was better than the flat sections to the east, and partly because of the way Sylvie managed the garden. She had read everything she could find about dryland farming techniques, and she applied what she read with the same precision she applied to the accounts, experimentally but not recklessly, adjusting based on what she saw. Hector watched her work and sometimes offered a thought, and sometimes just watched, because some people think best when they're being witnessed without being interrupted, and Sylvie Beaumont was one of them. He was 51 years old, and he had spent 11 years among people who mostly wanted him for his physical capacity, to haul, to trap, to ride, to build. He was not used to being around someone who was thinking hard about something and doing it visibly, and he found that he liked it. He found that he looked forward, in the evenings, to the particular slant of conversation that happened around Eugenia's table, which ranged from the practical to the philosophical to the historical, in ways that were not orderly but were always interesting. It was Eugenia who said, one evening in July, "Hector, why did you stay away so long?" Sylvie looked up from the accounts. Hector was quiet for a moment. He was 51 years old. He had been asked things before that he hadn't answered. But Eugenia was 68, and she asked the question the way old people sometimes ask things. Not with an agenda, just with genuine curiosity, the way you ask a question when you have enough life behind you to know that the answers usually turn out to be simpler and sadder than you expected. "I left because I thought I'd come back in a year," he said. "And then the year passed, and I'd gotten used to being gone. And then more years passed, and I suppose I thought." He stopped. "I suppose I thought that coming back would make it real, that he was gone, that the place would be changed, that I'd have to look at it and know I'd wasted the time." The kitchen was quiet. "And now?" Eugenia said. "Now I'm here," Hector said, "and it is real, and the time was wasted." He looked at the table. "But the land is still here, and we're here," Eugenia said cheerfully and got up to put the kettle on. It was in August that Sylvie's knee gave out. She had been carrying water from the creek, a thing she did twice a day, 40 pounds at a time in 2 buckets, up a slope that was not severe but was uneven, and she stepped wrong on a loose stone and went down hard, twisting her left knee in a way that made a sound that Hector heard from 30 yards away and that told him everything he needed to know before he was even moving toward her. She was sitting up when he got to her, which was a good sign. She was 26 years old, and she was furious, which was also a good sign. "I'm fine," she said. "You're not," he said. "I'm fine," she said again, more firmly, as though volume would help. He crouched beside her and looked at the knee without touching it. The joint was already beginning to swell. She was 26, and she had the particular stubbornness of young people who have had to manage everything themselves, which is the stubbornness of people who have learned that asking for help is not always an option, and have therefore deleted the option from their internal accounting. "Can you put weight on it?" he said. She tried. The answer was no. He carried her to the cabin. She objected to this. He carried her anyway, because the alternative was watching her crawl up a slope on a bad knee, and he was 51 years old and still capable of carrying a person 20 yards up a slight incline regardless of their opinions on the matter. Eugenia wrapped the knee in strips of cloth soaked in cold water and told Sylvie that she was to sit still for at least 3 days, and told her this in the tone of a woman who is 68 years old and has already decided how the argument ends. Hector carried the water from the creek for the next 2 weeks. He carried it without comment. At the end of the first week, Sylvie said, from her chair by the window, "You don't have to do that, you know." "I know," he said, and went back out for the second trip. She watched him from the window. She was 26 years old, and she was thinking something that she wasn't ready to put into words yet, so she wrote it in the accounts ledger instead, in the margin, in very small pencil, not the thing itself, just a mark, a small asterisk, the way you mark something you want to come back to. September came in cool and dry, which was better than August had been. The garden had produced through the summer, not abundantly, Not the way a wet year produces, but steadily, which in 1934 felt like its own kind of miracle. Sylvie's knee healed well enough that she stopped limping by the third week, though she was careful on the creek slope now, which Hector had leveled out and laid with flat stones in her absence. She did not say anything about the stones when she first saw them. She said later that evening to Eugenia privately, "He fixed the slope." "I see that," Eugenia said. "He didn't mention it." "No," Eugenia said, "he wouldn't." Sylvie was quiet. "He's 51, Eugenia said, mildly, not looking up from her mending. "I know how old he is," Sylvie said. "And you're 26. I know how old I am." "I'm not saying it's a problem," Eugenia said. "Saying it's a number. Numbers aren't the same as problems." She bit off a thread. "Your grandfather was 14 years older than your grandmother, and they had 51 years together, and she outlived him by 9 and missed him every single one of them." Sylvie didn't say anything. "I'm not meddling," Eugenia said. "You're meddling," Sylvie said. "I'm providing historical context," Eugenia said, with great dignity. "There is a difference." It was October when Hector asked her to walk with him out to the north pasture at dusk, which was the kind of request that could mean nothing or could mean something, and Sylvie went because she had made a decision, around the time of the flat stones on the creek slope, that she was going to stop pretending she didn't know what she knew. The light was the kind of October light that only happens on the southern Alberta prairie. Gold and long and slightly unreal, the way the last warmth of the year holds on with both hands before winter comes. The Livingstone Range was blue in the west. The dry grass caught the light and held it. He was 51 years old. He stood beside her and looked out at the pasture and at the mountains, and she could see him gathering himself, which was the way Hector Dunmore did everything, quietly and with preparation, without hurry. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He asked her. She was 26 years old. She had come to this land with nothing but 2 suitcases and an elderly relative, and the particular determination of someone who had run out of alternatives. She had pointed a rifle at this man on an April evening, and he had gotten off his horse slowly and kept his hands visible and asked her, before anything else, whether she had eaten. She thought about 51 and 26. She thought about her grandfather and her grandmother. She thought about the flat stones on the creek slope. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that told her he had been less certain of the answer than he'd tried to appear, which was the most endearing thing he had ever done. The mountains went blue to purple. The grass held the last of the gold. They were married in November, in Pincher Creek, in a church that smelled of wood smoke and candle wax, by a minister who had known Hector's father and said so twice during the ceremony in the gentle, wandering way of old men who find occasions for reminiscence wherever they go. Eugenia, who was 68 years old, wore her good coat and wept quietly, and told anyone who asked that she was not weeping she had simply been outdoors, and the wind was sharp. The winter of 1934 was hard. The winters in southern Alberta are almost always hard. But there were 3 people in the cabin instead of 2. And there was wood enough in the new woodshed. And there was food in the root cellar from the garden. And there was the particular warmth of a household, where everyone knows what they're doing and knows the people next to them know what they're doing, which is a different quality of warmth than heat alone provides. Eugenia, who was 68 years old, sat by the stove in the evenings and told stories. She had grown up in Manitoba and come west as a young woman, and she had seen things: the building of the railway, the first automobiles arriving in small towns, the Great War, the flu, the land boom, and the land bust. She told the stories plainly, without self-pity, with occasional dark humor of the sort that people develop when they have seen enough of life to know that dark humor is sometimes the most accurate form of description. Hector listened to her stories. He had not, in 11 years of being alone, been listened to or listened much to others, and he found that listening to Eugenia was like putting a deprived sense to work again. Something coming back online that he hadn't known had gone quiet. Sylvie, who was 26, mended clothes and read from the 2 books they had between them, and sometimes fell asleep in her chair before the fire went down, and Hector would put a blanket over her without waking her, and Eugenia would watch this from across the room with the expression of a woman who has lived 68 years and knows what things look like when they're right. Eugenia Pratt died in the March of 1938. She was 72 years old, and she died in her bed in the cabin, which was where she had wanted to die, on land that was not technically hers, but that she had worked and earned and been buried on with full honors in a corner of the north pasture that Sylvie chose. And Hector fenced in, carefully, with new cedar posts and good wire, so the cattle wouldn't trouble the ground. She had not been alone when she died. That had mattered to her. That had mattered to them. Sylvie was 30 years old when Eugenia died. She sat by the grave for a long time in the cold March afternoon with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the mountains, and Hector sat beside her without saying anything because there was nothing to say, and he knew enough by then to know it. By 1938, the land was producing better. The Dust Bowl was easing, slowly the rains beginning to return, the topsoil slowly rebuilding where it could. The Dunmore quarter section had a proper kitchen garden and a small herd of cattle and a chicken operation that had expanded to 31 birds and required more management than either of them had anticipated when it was 7 birds. They had hired a boy from town 2 summers running to help with the haying. They had a daughter. She had been born in 1936, in the cabin, in January, and her name was June, because Sylvie said she wanted something warm. June Dunmore, born January 1936, in a cabin near Pincher Creek, Alberta, in the middle of a hard decade, which is a good way to start a life. Not because the hardness is good, but because knowing from the beginning that hard things can be survived is a kind of knowledge that holds. Hector was 53 years old when June was born, and he held her with the careful attention of a man who has spent decades handling things that can be broken, which is to say he held her very well. The homestead grew, the fences held, the garden grew each spring a little more elaborate, a little more confident, as though the land itself was learning to trust the hands that were tending it. In the evenings, Hector sat on the porch that he had rebuilt in 1935. Proper foundation, good lumber, a view out across the pasture to the mountains, and watched the light change on the Livingstone Range the way his father had watched it before him. He was 51 years old when he came home. He was 62 when he sat on that porch. One evening in October, the grass gone gold, his daughter asleep inside, his wife's voice carrying out from the kitchen where she was talking to the neighbor woman who had come for supper. He thought about 11 years of not coming back. He thought about what he had found when he did. Some mistakes cost you time. If you're lucky, if you're very lucky, the time is the only thing they cost you, and what you find at the end of the road back makes the road worth having traveled. Well, there you have it. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this one, I thank you more than I can properly say. Stories like Hector and Sylvie's, the ones about coming home, about finding something worth coming home to, those are the ones I keep coming back to, because I think somewhere in all of us there's a piece of land we've been avoiding going back to. Maybe it's a place. Maybe it's a person. Maybe it's just a version of yourself you left behind somewhere along the road. Wherever you're hearing this from tonight, whether it's a farmhouse in Alberta or an apartment somewhere far away from any prairie, I hope you're warm and I hope you're held. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are. I read every single one, and I mean that. God bless you. Keep writing.